Symbolic diplomacy as a power signal is one of the most underestimated forces in international politics, yet it consistently shapes perceptions, alliances, and global narratives. When a state leader deliberately breaks diplomatic protocol, it is rarely accidental. Protocol exists to preserve hierarchy, neutrality, and predictability. When it is altered, the alteration itself becomes the message. In this case, offering a culturally specific, highly visible form of welcome is not only about hospitality, it is about broadcasting alignment, recognition, and strategic intent to both allies and rivals. Such gestures function as political language, communicating meaning without formal agreements or signed documents. Symbolic diplomacy works because global politics is not driven solely by treaties and military power. It is also shaped by images, rituals, and public performance. A handshake in front of cameras, the order of flags, the seating arrangement at a table, or the tone of a welcome ceremony can signal shifts in priority and partnership. When a powerful nation adopts the customs of another political or cultural sphere, it sends a message of respect and solidarity that resonates strongly with audiences who feel historically marginalized by dominant global powers. These symbolic acts are carefully calculated to influence public opinion, regional sentiment, and international credibility. Breaking protocol also allows leaders to challenge existing power structures without directly confronting them militarily or economically. It becomes a low cost, high impact strategy. Instead of imposing sanctions or deploying forces, a leader can use symbolism to question the legitimacy of established diplomatic norms and redefine who deserves recognition and authority. In a world increasingly shaped by media coverage and digital communication, symbolic moments travel faster and farther than policy documents. A single image can reach millions within minutes, shaping narratives that take months or years to undo. At the same time, symbolic diplomacy creates space for alternative alliances to form. When traditional power centers appear closed or selective in their partnerships, other actors step in by offering public gestures of inclusion and respect. This builds political capital, especially among countries seeking new partners outside long-standing Western frameworks. It also signals to domestic audiences that their leadership is active on the global stage, projecting strength and independence in foreign policy decisions. However, symbolism is not neutral. It carries ideological weight. It can reinforce certain narratives while sidelining others. A symbolic welcome may elevate one political actor while implicitly downgrading another. This is why protocol breaking moments often generate strong reactions from international observers. Supporters see bold leadership and strategic independence, while critics view the same action as provocation or manipulation. Both interpretations reveal how powerful symbolic diplomacy has become in shaping modern geopolitics. Ultimately, symbolic diplomacy functions as a form of soft power, one that relies on perception, cultural resonance, and strategic storytelling rather than force. It is not designed to replace traditional power tools, but to complement them by shaping the emotional and psychological environment in which political decisions are made, influencing how nations interpret intentions, alliances, and future directions, creating momentum that can either stabilize relationships or intensify rivalries, depending on how the signal is received and responded to by the international community and regional actors watching closely from the sidelines. The rise of a multipolar world order represents one of the most significant structural shifts in global politics in the modern era. For decades, international power was concentrated in the hands of a few dominant states, with one leading power setting the tone for economic rules, security arrangements, and diplomatic norms. That era is now being challenged by the emergence of multiple centers of influence, each seeking greater autonomy, recognition, and strategic space. This transition is not sudden but gradual, driven by economic growth in developing regions, technological diffusion, and changing patterns of trade and investment. In a multipolar system, no single nation can easily dictate global outcomes. Instead, power is distributed across regional blocs and rising states that pursue their own interests and alliances. Countries in Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America are no longer passive participants in global affairs. They are increasingly shaping trade routes, energy markets, and political coalitions. This shift creates a more complex international environment where diplomacy requires constant negotiation rather than reliance on fixed alliances or inherited influence. Economic transformation plays a central role in this process. As emerging economies expand their industrial capacity and consumer markets, they gain leverage in global supply chains. Infrastructure projects, energy partnerships, and regional development banks have become tools through which new power centers project influence. Control over critical resources such as energy, rare minerals, and technology platforms further strengthens the bargaining position of states that were once economically dependent on traditional powers. The rise of multipolarity also reshapes global institutions. Organizations that were originally designed around a post war balance of power now face pressure to adapt. Voting structures, leadership positions, and decision making rules are increasingly contested. New institutions and alternative financial systems are being developed to reduce reliance on established frameworks. This institutional competition reflects a broader struggle over who sets the rules of global engagement and whose interests are prioritized. At the political level, multipolarity encourages strategic flexibility. Nations are less likely to align permanently with a single power bloc. Instead, they pursue issue based partnerships, cooperating on trade with one group, security with another, and development with a third. This fluidity allows states to maximize benefits while reducing dependency, but it also increases uncertainty and competition as alliances become more transactional and less ideologically fixed. Culturally and ideologically, the multipolar shift challenges the idea that there is only one model of governance, development, or modernization. Different regions promote alternative approaches based on their historical experiences and social structures. This diversity of models weakens the dominance of any single narrative about progress and political legitimacy. At the global level, multipolarity does not automatically guarantee stability or fairness. While it reduces the concentration of power, it also creates overlapping spheres of influence and competing regional ambitions. This can generate friction, diplomatic standoffs, and economic rivalry, especially in strategically important areas such as energy corridors, maritime routes, and technological infrastructure. The rise of a multipolar world is therefore not simply about new powers replacing old ones, but about the transformation of how power itself is exercised, negotiated, and perceived, redefining global relationships and forcing states to operate in a landscape where influence is fragmented, constantly shifting, and shaped by multiple centers of authority rather than a single dominant force, economic interests. Behind political gestures reveal the often hidden foundation of international diplomacy. Public ceremonies, symbolic welcomes, and high profile meetings may appear driven by ideology or moral positioning, but beneath the surface, economic calculations frequently guide these decisions. States operate within competitive global markets, and diplomatic actions are designed to secure access to resources, expand trade networks, protect strategic industries, and strengthen long term economic influence. Political symbolism becomes a tool that opens doors to negotiations, contracts, and partnerships that might otherwise remain inaccessible. Energy remains one of the most powerful drivers of diplomatic engagement. Countries that control oil, gas, and alternative energy infrastructure hold leverage over industrial economies that depend on stable supply. Diplomatic gestures toward regions affected by conflict or instability often align with efforts to secure energy corridors and transportation routes. Ports, pipelines, and shipping lanes are not just physical infrastructure, they are economic lifelines that shape national security and foreign policy. When leaders extend symbolic recognition or public solidarity, they are often signaling interest in maintaining or expanding control over these critical economic pathways. Arms trade and defense partnerships also operate quietly behind political theater. Military cooperation agreements, training programs, and weapons sales generate long term revenue streams and political influence. By strengthening ties with specific regions, major powers position themselves as preferred security partners. This creates dependency relationships that extend beyond individual contracts, tying recipient states into broader strategic and economic networks that benefit suppliers through maintenance agreements, technology transfers, and future upgrades. Trade and market access form another central layer of this dynamic. Diplomatic engagement often targets emerging markets with growing consumer populations and expanding industrial capacity. Symbolic political support can smooth negotiations for favorable trade terms, investment protections, and infrastructure development projects. Large-scale construction contracts, telecommunications networks, and transportation systems frequently follow high-profile diplomatic visits. These projects not only generate profits, but also embed foreign companies into the economic fabric of host countries. Financial influence further amplifies the connection between politics and economics. Loans, development funding, and investment programs are commonly linked to diplomatic alignment. States that receive favorable financing terms may adjust their foreign policy positions in return. This creates a cycle in which economic dependency reinforces political loyalty. Even humanitarian aid and reconstruction assistance can be strategically structured to benefit donor economies through procurement contracts and supply chains. At the same time, economic motivations are not limited to material gain. They also include competition over technological dominance. Control over digital infrastructure, data networks, and communication systems is increasingly central to global power. Diplomatic gestures toward technologically strategic regions reflect efforts to expand digital ecosystems and standardize platforms that lock countries into specific technological frameworks. Public audiences often see the ceremonial side of diplomacy, but rarely the negotiations that take place behind closed doors. These negotiations determine tariff structures, investment rights, regulatory access, and long-term economic positioning. Political symbolism serves as the public-facing narrative that legitimizes these deals and presents them as acts of solidarity or partnership rather than strategic economic maneuvering. Understanding the economic foundation of political gestures is essential to interpreting global events accurately. Without this lens, diplomacy appears driven by personality or ideology alone. With it, the deeper patterns of competition, cooperation, and strategic calculation become visible, revealing how global power is built not only through military strength or political influence, but through economic architecture that shapes relationships between states, regions, and markets. The danger of politics as theater lies in the growing gap between public performance and real policy outcomes. In the modern media-driven world, political leaders increasingly operate on a stage where optics matter as much as, and sometimes more than, substance. Carefully choreographed ceremonies, dramatic statements, and symbolic gestures are designed to capture attention, dominate headlines, and shape public perception. While these performances can create the illusion of decisive leadership, they often distract from the deeper structural problems that require long-term planning, negotiation, and institutional reform. When politics becomes theater, complexity is reduced to spectacle. Conflicts are simplified into narratives of heroes and villains, while economic hardship, humanitarian crises, and governance failures are overshadowed by dramatic photo opportunities. This shift benefits leaders who prefer visibility over accountability. Instead of being judged by measurable improvements in living standards, infrastructure, or social stability, they are evaluated based on popularity, media coverage, and symbolic displays of power. As a result, public discourse becomes emotional rather than analytical, driven by reactions rather than informed debate. Theatrical politics also weakens democratic engagement and international trust. Citizens who repeatedly witness grand gestures without meaningful outcomes begin to lose confidence in institutions. Over time, this erodes civic participation and encourages cynicism. On the global stage, countries that rely heavily on symbolism without policy follow through risk, damaging their credibility. Diplomatic partners may initially respond to public gestures, but long-term cooperation depends on consistency, reliability, and tangible commitments. Another danger lies in the manipulation of public sentiment. Political theater often relies on emotionally charged imagery and rhetoric to mobilize support or divert attention from domestic challenges. National pride, fear, and identity are commonly used to create loyalty and suppress criticism. This can intensify polarization within societies and fuel tensions between nations. When leaders prioritize spectacle, they may escalate rhetoric or stage confrontational moments simply to maintain visibility, increasing the risk of misunderstanding and conflict. Media platforms amplify this effect by rewarding dramatic content over nuanced analysis. Short clips, viral images, and emotionally loaded statements spread faster than detailed policy discussions. As a result, leaders adapt their behavior to fit media logic rather than governance needs. Policy decisions are shaped by how they will appear on screens rather than how they will function in reality. This creates a feedback loop where performance becomes the primary goal and governance becomes secondary. For populations directly affected by conflict, poverty, or political instability, Theatrical diplomacy offers little relief. Symbolic gestures do not rebuild homes, provide food, restore healthcare systems, or create employment opportunities. When leaders substitute performance for policy, real suffering is pushed into the background. Humanitarian concerns become talking points rather than priorities. The danger of politics as theater is not only that it misleads audiences, but that it reshapes political culture itself. Over time, institutions adapt to prioritize visibility, public relations, and messaging strategies. Bureaucratic expertise and long term planning lose influence compared to media advisors and branding specialists. This transformation undermines the capacity of governments to address complex challenges such as economic inequality, climate pressures, migration, and regional instability. Recognizing this pattern is essential for understanding why many high profile diplomatic moments fail to produce lasting change, why public trust continues to decline, and why international relations increasingly resemble performance arenas rather than problem solving spaces where cooperation and accountability guide decision making. The call for justice focused global leadership reflects a growing demand for a shift in how power is exercised on the international stage. Traditional models of leadership have often prioritized national dominance, strategic advantage, and economic extraction over human welfare and social stability. In contrast, justice focused leadership emphasizes responsibility, fairness, and the protection of vulnerable populations. It challenges leaders to move beyond narrow national interests and consider the broader consequences of their policies on global communities, particularly those affected by conflict, poverty, and political instability. At the core of this approach is the principle of human dignity. Policies are evaluated not only by their strategic success, but by their impact on ordinary people. Access to food, healthcare, education, and safe living conditions becomes a central measure of effective leadership. When governments prioritize arms sales, political alliances, or economic profit without addressing humanitarian needs, they reinforce systems that perpetuate suffering and inequality. Justice focused leadership seeks to reverse this pattern by placing social welfare and human rights at the center of decision making. Economic fairness is another critical pillar. Global inequality continues to widen as wealth and resources concentrate in the hands of a few powerful actors. Justice oriented leaders advocate for fair trade practices, debt relief for struggling nations, and development models that support local industries rather than extractive economic systems. This approach recognizes that long term stability cannot be achieved without addressing structural imbalances in global markets and financial institutions. Sustainable development, responsible investment, and inclusive economic policies become tools for building shared prosperity. In the realm of diplomacy, justice focused leadership promotes dialogue over coercion. Instead of relying on sanctions, military pressure, or political isolation as primary strategies, it encourages negotiation, mediation, and multilateral cooperation. This does not imply weakness, but rather a commitment to conflict resolution that minimizes civilian harm and long term destabilization. Building trust through transparency and consistent engagement becomes a central objective. Environmental responsibility also plays a crucial role. Climate change disproportionately affects vulnerable populations, intensifying food shortages, displacement, and economic insecurity. Leaders who prioritize justice recognize environmental protection as a moral and political obligation. International cooperation on renewable energy conservation and climate adaptation becomes essential for protecting future generations and preventing further global inequality. Justice focused leadership requires accountability at both national and international levels. Governments must be willing to evaluate their own actions, acknowledge mistakes, and adjust policies accordingly. International institutions must strengthen mechanisms that hold powerful actors responsible for violations of humanitarian norms and international law. Without accountability, justice remains symbolic rather than practical. Public participation further strengthens this leadership model. When citizens are informed, engaged, and empowered to influence policy, governments are more likely to act in the public interest. Grassroots movements, civil society organizations, and independent media contribute to shaping a political environment where ethical leadership is rewarded rather than ignored. The call for justice focused global leadership is ultimately a response to widespread dissatisfaction with systems that prioritize power over people, urging a transformation in global governance that centers cooperation, equity, and human welfare as foundational principles rather than secondary considerations in international decision making and political strategy.